Friends, welcome to Storytime for the Apocalypse. So great to have you here. I'm Tilly Hinton, if we haven't met already, and I'm the curator and host of Storytime. This is a particularly special edition. It's our second ever guest programmed edition. Meredith Lancaster created an incredible guest programmed episode last year around Black Lives Matter with an all-Black lineup of readers and readings. And tonight we hand the reins over to NiCHE, the Network in Canadian History and Environment, for an all-Canadian lineup of readers and readings. And I am so excited to welcome NiCHE to this community and to soak up the beautiful readings that have been selected for us. Let's begin, as we always do, by acknowledging the lands on which we are gathered. Here in Los Angeles, I'm on Tongva land, and far from here, I was born on Durrumbul country and raised up in Gubbi Gubbi land on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. In the chat window, it would be so fabulous if you would acknowledge the owners of the land that you are joining us from. And if you're not sure who that is, there is a fantastic website. A Canadian Indigenous-led nonprofit organization has made this global resource that I'm sharing in the chat now, nativeland.ca, where you can look up who owns the land where you are. So please, I see some of you have already acknowledged the country that you're joining from. Add it to the chat if you haven't had a chance to already. So welcome, friends, to episode 15, a special episode guest curated by the good folks at NiCHE, as I was saying. Some months ago, I entrusted the programming of this episode to Dr. Jessica Dewitt, who is social media editor, executive member of NiCHE, the editor-in-chief of the Otter blog, as well as an accomplished historian and digital communications expert. So tonight, you will hear from Jessica, and you will hear as well from three of her fellow Canadian environmental historians, Dr. Andrew Watson, Dr. Heather Green, and Dr. Sarah Spike. You'll hear stories about the end of the world as we know it, about the earth finally breaking, about a cripplingly hot summer with no relief, and about how time and extinction are not as linear as we may have thought. If you're new to Storytime, welcome to the family. And if you're returning, welcome back. Here at Storytime, we recreate the childhood comfort of bedtime stories, library stories, campfire stories, and classroom stories that have soothed listeners and readers for the longest time. To the seemingly endless complexities of these times, we rest briefly in the safety, the beauty, and the inspiration that beautiful writing can provide. So, as ever, your four readers tonight will bring you readings about apocalypses. And if you're a Storytime regular, you know what that means. We work with the original definition of the word apocalypse. It means, in Greek, to uncover, to remove the veil, or to reveal. That might mean readings about discovery, revelation, unveiling, change, transformation, things exploding, worlds ending, sharks, tornadoes. There is room for everything here. Starting today's story time is Dr. Andrew Watson. Andrew is assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan. His current research includes the history of sustainability and tourism on the Canadian Shield in Muskoka, I hope I'm saying that right, Ontario, the environmental, social, and economic history of coal in Canada, and the role of energy in shaping agro-ecosystems on the Great Plains of the United States. Andrew, welcome to Storytime. The stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Tilly. And also thanks a lot to Jessica for getting me involved in this. It was a long time ago when I think we organized this, and been looking forward to it since then. So thanks very much, Tilly. I guess I'll just jump into it. My reading is from a novel called Station 11, and I'm going to read from from chapter 6 from Emily St. John Mandel's novel Station 11. So, an incomplete list. No more diving into pools of chlorinated water lit green from below. No more ball games played out under floodlights. No more porch lights with moths fluttering on summer nights. No more trains running under the surface of cities on the dazzling power of the electric third rail. No more cities. No more films, except rarely, except with a generator drowning out half the dialogue, and only then for the first little while until the fuel for the generators ran out, because automobile gas goes stale after 2 or 3 years. Aviation gas lasts longer, but it was difficult to come by. No more screens shining in the half light as people raise their phones above the crowd to take photographs of concert stages. No more concert stages lit by candy-colored halogens. No more electronica, punk electric guitars. No more pharmaceuticals. No more certainty of surviving a scratch on one's hand, a cut on a finger while chopping vegetables for dinner, a dog bite. No more flight. No more towns glimpsed from the sky through airplane windows, points of glimmering light. No more looking down from 30,000 feet and imagining the lives lit up by those lights at that moment. No more airplanes. No more requests to put your tray in its upright and locked position. But no, that wasn't true. There were still planes here and there. They stood dormant on runways and in hangars. They collected snow on their wings. In the cold months, they were ideal for food storage. In the summer, the ones near orchards were filled with trays of fruit that dehydrated in the heat. Teenagers snuck into them to have sex. Rust blossomed and streaked. No more countries. All borders unmanned. No more fire departments. No more police. No more road maintenance or garbage pickup. No more spacecraft rising up from Cape Canaveral, from Baikonur Cosmodrome, from Vandenberg, from Plesetsk, from Tanaganisha, burning paths through the atmosphere into space. No more internet. No more social media. No more scrolling through litanies of dreams and nervous hopes and photographs of lunches, cries for help and expressions of contentment and relationship status updates with heart icons, whole or broken, plans to meet up later, pleas, complaints, desires, pictures of babies dressed as bears or peppers for Halloween. No more reading and commenting on the lives of others, and in so doing, feeling slightly less alone in the room. No more avatars. So that is a quick sort of rundown and an entirety of a chapter from this novel that captures a sense of the ways in which the author wants us to think about how things end. What kinds of things might end if a global pandemic wiped out most people on the planet, and what kinds of things then linger, what kinds of things remain afterwards, either in memory or left over as kind of a material reality that might survive after or not after an apocalypse.
Andrew, thank you so much. I don't know about other people, but I was mentally checking off the things that I would very happily let go of and the things that I would dearly miss. And there was such a roller coaster of both in that beautiful reading. Thank you. And I saw Zoe saying in the chat that you read from one of her favorite books. I love that. I love that we were able to kick off with one of Zoe's favorites. Andrew, thank you such a lot for getting us started. And next up, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Heather Green. Heather hails from Cape Breton in Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada. She did her BA there, hopped islands over to St. John's in Newfoundland for her MA, and then headed out west to Edmonton, where she completed her PhD in history from the University of Alberta. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University, and in 2019, She returned to her home province to be an assistant professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax. She is a historian who specializes in environmental history and histories of Indigenous settler relations, with a particular focus on histories of mining, colonialism, heritage, and tourism. Her work primarily focuses on the Canadian North, and she's also researched mining, energy production, and Indigenous activism in the American Southwest, recognized and supported by a prestigious Fulbright Fellowship, where she was located at the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona. Heather is an editor and executive member of NiCHE, the Network in Canadian History and Environment, and is co-convener of NiCHE's Northern Borders Project, which is all about borders and transgressions in the Arctic circumpolar North. She teaches environmental history, Canadian history, Indigenous settler histories, and history and film. Somehow, Heather also finds time for hiking, craft beer, gardening, and going on adventures with her dog, Whiskey. Heather, welcome to Storytime.
Thank you, Tilly. That introduction, I feel, is longer than my reading is going to be. So before I get into my reading, which is The Marrow, Thieves by Sheree Demiline, I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming today from Mi'kmaq, which is the traditional and unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nation here in Nova Scotia. And I thought for my reading too, it might be helpful to give a really quick content warning, because this book is about a futuristic world destroyed by global warming, where settlers have lost the ability to dream, and the solution that they turn to is to extract dreams from the bone marrow of Indigenous peoples. And so there are elements of violence in the book, and some elements of violence and cultural violence in the passage that I will read today. So to start my reading, it's a short but full chapter from the book. This time, Mi'kwan's picked up where he'd left off the night that Rose first arrived. The earth was broken. Too much taking for too damn long, so she finally broke. But she went out like a wild horse, bucking off as much as she could before lying down. A melting north meant the water levels rose and the weather changed. It changed to violence in some cases, building tsunamis, spinning tornadoes, crumbling earthquakes, and the shapes of countries were changed forever, whole coasts breaking off like crust. And all those pipelines in the ground, they snapped like icicles and spewed bile over forests, into lakes, drowning whole reserves and towns. So much laid to waste from the miscalculation of infallibility in the face of a planet's revolt. People died in the millions when that happened. The ones that were left had to migrate inward. It was like the second coming of the boats. So many sick people and not enough time to organize peacefully. But the powers that be still refused to change and bent the already stooped under the whips of a schedule made for a population twice its size and inflated by the need to rebuild. Those that were left worked longer, worked harder. And now the sun was gone for weeks at a time. The suburban structure of their lives had been upended, and so they got sicker, but this time in the head. They stopped dreaming. And a man without dreams is just a meaty machine with a broken gauge. People lost their minds, killing themselves and others, and even worse, for the new order, refusing to work at all. They needed answers, solutions. So up here, the governors turned to the church and the scientists to find a cure for the missing dreams. In the meantime, those who could afford it turned to sleep counselors, took pills to go to bed and pills to wake up, and did things like group hypnosis to implant new dreams. At first, people turned to Indigenous people the way the New Agers had, all reverence and curiosity, looking for ways we could help guide them. And then they changed on us like the New Agers had, looking for ways that they could take what we had and administer it themselves. How could they best appropriate the uncanny ability we kept to dream? How could they make ceremony better, more efficient, more economical? This was the first alarm set off in the communities. We thought that was the worst of it, if only. We were moved off lands that were deemed necessary to the government, same way they took reserve land during wartime. because no one cared about long-range things like courting votes for the next election, and instead cared about things like keeping valued, wealthy community members safe. There were no negotiations. We were just pushed off. The new migration from the coastlines was changing geography daily. And then even after a way of life was being commoditized, after our lands were filled with water companies and wealthy corporate investors, we were still hopeful because we had each other. New communities started to form and we were gathering strength. But then the church and the scientists that were working day and night on the dream problem came up with their solution and everything went to hell. They asked for volunteers first, put out ads asking for people with indigenous bloodlines and good general health to check in with local clinics for medical trials. They'd give you room and board for a week and a small honorarium to pay for your time off work. By then, our distrust had grown stronger, and they didn't get any volunteers from the public, so they turned to the prisons. The prisons were always full of our people. Whether or not the prisons went voluntarily, who knows? There weren't enough people worried about the well-being of prisoners to really make sure. It began as a rumor that they found a way to siphon the dreams right out of our bones. A rumor whispered every time one of us went missing. A rumor denounced every time their doctor sent us to hospitals and treatment centers never to return. They kept sending us away, enticing us to seek medical care, and then keeping us locked up, figuring out ways to hone and perfect their solution for sale. Soon they needed too many bodies, and they turned to history to show them how to best keep us warehoused, how to best position the culling. That's when the new residential school started growing up from the dirt like poisonous brick mushrooms. We go to the schools and they leach the dreams from where our ancestors hid them, in the honeycombs of slushy marrow buried in our bones. And us? Well, we join our ancestors, hoping we left enough dreams behind for the next generation to stumble across. And that's the end of that chapter.
Who could have known back when you selected this reading how particularly poignant it would be in this moment? I really thank you for bringing it to us and for the sensitivity of bringing it, because like so much apocalyptic literature, this piece really reveals such a lot about the past and the present injustices and is so far from being fictional that it's just heartbreaking. I feel like that one might just need a minute of space before we jump in and meet Sarah. And in fact, I might ask that we spend a minute in silent reflection if people are comfortable to do that. I'm going to mute my mic because it can get terribly loud here, and I will call you back in a minute's time. Let's reflect on the past and the current injustices that have been so in the news in Canada and obviously reverberating around the world in recent days. Let me gently bring you back. And if anybody in this community has readings that they recommend, particularly to us non-Canadians, to educate ourselves better about the history of residential schools and the recent revelations of such tragic treatment and death, please feel free to share in the chat window. Anybody at all who can guide our way in what we need to learn, please do share. Heather, thank you. It's been wonderful to have you on the Storytime stage. And with that, let me introduce you to Dr. Sarah Spike, the creator of Twitter Small Histories, shares real daily news extracts drawn directly from the pages of rural and small town newspapers across Nova Scotia between 1880 and 1910. It is a gloriously immersive time warp and a brilliant way to bring old history to new audiences. Sarah is a cultural historian of rural communities and coastal environments in Atlantic Canada. She is a postdoctoral research associate at the L.R. Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. She lives in rural Nova Scotia in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Her research uses a range of unconventional perspectives to explore the historical worlds of rural Canadians, illuminating and recuperating overlooked aspects of rural culture and knowledge. Her current research project, Cultural Histories of Fog in Atlantic Canada, explores how the perpetual presence of fog has shaped life and culture in this coastal region, offering a new entry point into histories of science, settler colonialism, seafaring, and daily life. Sarah also documents her landscapes with forests, fog, flowers, and squirrel images on social media. They are an immersive, no flights necessary way to travel to Canada wherever you are in the world, and I commend them to you. Over to you, Sarah, and welcome to Storytime.
Thank you so much, Tilly, and thanks so much for having us. And thanks, Jessica, so much for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm going to read from Alistair Mcleod. Was a short story writer, Canadian short story writer, quite famous for his really evocative depictions of Atlantic Canada, of Nova Scotia in particular, where Heather and I both are from, and where I'm coming from you today. Tilly already mentioned that I'm in Nova Scotia, in Mi'kma'ki. It's the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So I wanted to read some extracts from the very beginning of a short story called The Closing Down of Summer by Alistair Mcleod. And the story was written in 1976, which I think is, to me, really a sort of prescient observation of a time that is about to transition really dramatically, or a place that's about to transition really dramatically. And it's just on the cusp of that transition now. It is August now, towards the end, and the weather can no longer be trusted. All summer it's been very hot. So hot that the gardens have died and the hay has not grown, and the surface wells have dried to dampened mud. The brooks that flow to the sea have dried to trickles, and the trout that inhabit them and the inland lakes are soft and sluggish and gasping for life. The heat has been bad for fish and wells and the growth of green, but for those who choose to lie on the beaches of the summer sun, the weather has been ideal. This is a record year for tourists in Nova Scotia, we're constantly being told. More motorists have crossed the border at Amherst than ever before. More cars have landed at the ferry docks in Yarmouth. Motels and campsites have been filled to capacity. The highways are heavy with touring buses and camper trailers and cars with the inevitable lobster traps fashioned to their roofs. Tourism is booming as never before. Here on this beach, on Cape Breton's west coast, there are no tourists, only ourselves. We've been here for most of the summer, surprised at the endurance and consistency of the heat, waiting for it to break and perhaps to change the spell. At the end of July, we said to ourselves and to each other, the August gale will come and shatter all of this. The August gale is the traditional storm that comes each August, the forerunner of the hurricanes that will sweep up from the Caribbean and beat and lash this coast in the months of autumn. The August gale, with its shrieking winds and crashing, muddied waves, has generally signaled the unofficial end of summer, and it may come in August's very early days. But this year, as yet, it has not come, and there are only a few days left. Still, we know that the weather cannot last much longer, and in another week, the tourists will be gone, the schools will reopen, and the pace of life will change. We will have to gather ourselves together then in some way and make the decisions that we've been postponing in the back of our minds. We are perhaps the best crew of shaft and development miners in the world, and we were due in South Africa on the 7th of July. But as yet, we've not gone. And the telegrams from Renco Development in Toronto have laid unanswered, and the telephone calls have been unreturned. All summer, we've watched our bodies change their color and seen our hair grow bleached and ever lighter. Only the scars that all of us bear fail to respond to the healing power of the sun's heat. They seem to stand out even more vividly now, long, running pink welts that course down our inner forearms, or jagged sawtooth ridges on the taut calves of our legs. Lying now upon the beach, we see the external scars on ourselves and on each other, and we're stirred to the memories of how they occurred. When we're clothed, the price we pay for what we do is not so visible as it is now. Beside us on the beach lie the white Javex containers filled with alcohol. It is the purest of moonshine made by our relatives back in the hills, and it's impossible to buy. It comes to us only as a gift or in exchange for long past favors, bringing home of bodies, small loans of forgotten dollars, kindnesses to now dead grandmothers. It is as clear as water, and a teaspoonful of it, when touched by a match, will burn with the low blue flame of a votive candle until it is completely consumed, leaving the teaspoon hot and totally dry. Out on the flatness of the sea, we can see the fishermen going about their work. They do not make much money anymore, and few of them take it seriously. They say that the grounds have been overfished by the huge factory fleets from Russia, Spain, and Portugal. And it is true that on the still warm nights, we can see the lights of such floating factories shining brightly off the coast. They appear as strange, movable, brilliant cities, and when they're far out, their blazing lights seem to mingle with those of the stars. The fishermen before us are older men or young boys, grandfathers with their grandsons acting out their ancient rituals. At noon or at 1 or 2 before they start for home, they will run their little boats into our quiet cove until their bows are almost touching the sand. They will toss us the gleaming blue-black mackerel and the silver herring and the brown and white striped cod and talk to us for a while, telling us anything that they think we should know. In return, we toss them the whitened Javex bottles so that they may drink the pure, clear contents. Later, we cook the fish over small, crackling driftwood fires. This, we know too, cannot go on much longer. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sarah. I didn't want that to end. What an immersive, incredible reading. Didn't you all feel like you were there, for better or worse, in that endless summer that wouldn't get broken by the August gale? Just gorgeous. To wrap up this evening, I am so pleased to welcome Jessica Dewitt, the reason that this collaboration happened, the mastermind of it. Jessica is an environmental historian of both Canada and the United States, as well as an editor and an accomplished digital communications strategist. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Saskatchewan in 2019. Raised in rural northwestern Pennsylvania, she's lived in Saskatoon, Canada for nearly a decade now. She is an executive member, editor, and social media editor for the Network in Canadian History and Environment, NiCHE. A passionate social justice advocate, she focuses on developing digital techniques and communications that bridge the divide between academia and the general public in order to democratize access to knowledge. Jessica is a working board member of Rock Saskatoon, a volunteer organization dedicated to the empowerment of female, trans, two-spirit, and gender-expansive youth and adults through collaborative music creation and performance. She also serves on the board of the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society and is a past editor of that society's magazine, Folklore. On Jessica's own blog, brilliantly called Historical Dewitticisms, you will find all kinds of treasure, including a weekly exploration of the most used words in the top stories shared amongst environmental historians and environmental humanities scholars on Twitter every week. It's a very expedient, but more importantly, engaging way to dive into what people are thinking about in the environmental humanities and what we're writing about week by week. Jessica, thank you for bringing this all-Canadian episode of Storytime into the world and for bringing us home with tonight's final reading. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Tilly. As I mentioned in the chat, I am joining everyone from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is Treaty 6 territory. It's also the homeland of the Métis and the traditional territory of the Dakota and Cree. And also, as Tilly mentioned, I'm originally from the States. I'm an American interloper, though I feel thoroughly Canadian after a decade here. But I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, which is the territory of the Erie. Tonight, I'm reading from Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson, who is an Indigenous Canadian author. And she is a member of the Heiltsuk and Haisla First Nations located on the coast of British Columbia. And I'm reading 3 different short passages from that book that represent deep time. And some people get really anxious when they think of how big the universe and the world and time is. But to me, I find a lot of comfort in that connection and that feeling of smallness, that I'm just a very small part of this vast world that we are in. So I'll start now. This first one is called Simultaneosity. Think of magic as a tree. The root of supernatural ability is simply the realization that all time exists simultaneously. Humans experience time as a progression of sequential events in much the same way we see the horizon as flat. Our reality is shaped by our limitations. If you blasted off in a rocket and achieved a low, stable orbit, you would see the planet's horizon curving into a sphere. But how, you may be wondering, can you blast yourself out of time? We don't know how to build those machines yet. Close your eyes. Concentrate on your breath. Remember that you were not always earthbound. Every living creature, every drop of water, and every somber mountain is the byblow of some bloated dying star. Deep down, we remember, wiggling through the universe as beams of light. The second passage is called Requiem for the Trilobites. 252 million years ago on Earth, in late May on a Monday, the Trilobites were going out for Starbucks before work. La, near swampy Pangaea, the single continent that stretched from pole to pole. The Trilobites tended to avoid the weird hippie mammals and reptiles that had decided to give land dwelling a go, and had descended into eating each other, their own young, and whatever else they could chase down and swallow. No accounting for taste, they told themselves. We'll stay here in the ocean doing exactly what we've been doing for the last 200 million years. Thank you very much. Not that the oceans were much safer. Still, the Trilobites weren't much worried about sharks, who at this point in their evolution looked like truck-sized tadpoles, and who in turn were meat for the Dinotrodons, mammals who had developed flashy back fins and were always ready to show off their teeth and their newly hinged jaws. The Trilobites had limped through an extinction event only 8 million years earlier, which had pruned off all but the hardiest and the luckiest of their species. Nevertheless, they were alive and looking forward to another 200 million years of avoiding being dinner for sea scorpions and the ancestors of crabs. But the Earth had a bad case of gas from a lot of undigested trees. Asteroids were due to boom through the atmosphere like falling angels, wings of fire. The area that would one day be Siberia was going to hurl lava like a frat boy upchucking this during rush week. Pangaea, the superest continent, was about to split like a tight pair of pants. The Permian age was about to convulse, boil, and die, taking 9 out of 10 of all living species, kicking and screaming into oblivion. The world would go dark. The ocean would become an airless acid bath. The clouds would rain death. but that was due to start tomorrow, the blackest of Tuesdays. And today was Monday. The Trilobites were blindsided by the end of the world. They were like, whoa, man, what the hell? What did we ever do to you? But no one answered. And they had nowhere to hide. Nowhere was safe. Every last Trilobite died. Their bodies were covered with mud and ash. And as the eons passed, they were pressed into fossils that would one day make lovely bookends and paperweights. Mass extinction sucks. And I'm going to finish with the human manual. Humans come with an instruction manual, some 24,000 genes, which, given the innumerable ways we malfunction, would appear to have been written by a dyslexic drunk on a bender. We're biological machines with consciousness, builders of empires, creators and destroyers of worlds, singers of sagas and dirges, able to envision the pearly gates of heaven and the fiery depths of hell, able to bounce around the moon, but unable to walk a couple of steps to put our water bottle in the recycling bin. The difference between us, between one human and another, is probably one DNA base pair in every 1,000. What does that mean? I can say with great certainty that you and I, we are born from women. We looked up at the night sky and see the same stars, the same moon. Breathe and sleep and pray and work and daydream and sing and cry and fight and love. But in the end, our bodies are meat. They rot in the ground or burn in the fire, or are pickled in their own casings, displaced like waxed fruit for family and friends to weep over. Our bodies are transitory vessels built from recycled carmine, like every other living being on this planet. Bits and parts of you have probably been a cricket, or a dinosaur, or a single blade of grass on the prairies. With all the power of technology and science in the world, I would bet you dollars to donuts that you still trust a human face to be human. But come closer, and let me speak to the creatures that swim in your ancient oceans, the old ones that sing to you in your dreams. Encoded memories so frayed you think they're extinct, but they wait, coiled and unblinking in your blood and your bones.
Jessica, that was incredible. What a journey from imagining the kind of Starbucks that Trilobites would have gone to really thinking about how each of us is literally a part of a blade of grass, is literally a tiny trace of a cricket. It's such a perfect perspective on who we are and where we are and perhaps why we are, and what a way to lead us into question time. If you are bursting to read the 4 books that you heard from tonight, I'll be sharing that reading list on Instagram after this evening, and it's a pretty great book list. But for now, let's focus in on Q&A. I wanted to begin, if I could, with Heather. Heather, one of your several research areas is history of mining. You also look at colonialism, heritage and tourism, Indigenous settler relations, as well as environmental history. Did you choose your research themes, or did they somehow choose you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and I'm sure my fellow panelists totally know what I mean by once you get into your research to a certain degree, you don't really remember anymore whether you chose it or it chose you. I think certainly in my experience, as I got more into graduate studies, I started to realize that there was actually some personal connections, I think, that led me to histories of mining in particular that I didn't really realize at first when I started focusing on mining. But as you had mentioned, Tilly, in my introduction, I grew up in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, which has a really rich history of coal mining. And even though coal mining, for the most part, has been over in Cape Breton for a long time, the history and the heritage of mining is still very strong. It's a really big part of the identity of Cape Breton as an island and of Cape Bretoners. And so while I grew up in Cape Breton, there was so much representation of mining around me. And in some ways I didn't really notice it as for what it was, but it was such a big sort of influencing part of self-identity, community identity. And as I got into university and started learning about environmental history, I realized that while on the island that I grew up on, there's so much focus on mining, but it's very much a celebratory focus. And I never heard any discussions about the environmental connection or environmental impacts that coal mining had. And so as I started to do graduate school, I was interested in exploring the connections between mining and environment. And I focused on mining in my master's, and then when I got into my PhD level, one of the reasons why I ended up choosing to study gold mining in the Yukon is because in a lot of ways, what I saw in the Yukon in terms of the representation of heritage, particularly in the tourism sector, in a lot of ways paralleled Cape Breton and what I grew up in. You know, the Klondike Gold Rush is probably one of the most well-known events of Canadian history. Certainly outside of Canada, it's more well-known than a lot of other cases of mining in the country. But when you're in Dawson City, when you're in the Klondike region of the Yukon, it is also a very celebratory history of mining. And the tourism industry is essentially built around this celebration of mining. And within the public realm and even within the academic world, there's not much discussion about the environmental consequences of gold mining, although it is very clearly a region that has been vastly transformed because of this extractive activity. But I think, you know, while I was interested in the environmental elements, the hyper focus on mining and mining history in that region tends to obscure the more complicated histories of the indigenous, the different indigenous groups that live in those areas. And so it also, in a sense, it sort of works to obscure or to erase in some ways the history of colonization that happened in the Yukon and around mining. So after I finished my PhD and as I progressed into my career, this is sort of my various interests in mining and in tourism and heritage essentially converged into the current research that I'm working on now with one of the First Nations in the Yukon, looking at the sort of landscape of heritage representation in the Klondike and attempting to think about ways that Indigenous narratives can be more clearly included within the sort of tourism spectrum of Dawson City in the Yukon more generally. So that was sort of a long way to say that I think in some ways it was there were personal connections, but the outside example of mining in the north with a strong Indigenous demographic really shaped that sort of seed that had been planted from the personal connection, but it, helped it sort of grow in different directions as well.
In a sense, your work is apocalyptic in that you're removing the veils of the obvious celebratory history, and you're peeling away those layers to discover the many, many aspects that lie underneath. Thank you for condensing years of intellectual effort into a couple of minutes. I know that can be a very challenging thing to do. We're going to jump now to Sarah. Sarah, I wanted to ask you about why or how you chose to read The Closing Down of Summer. And I want to squeeze in a little extra question if I could, which is that the incredible Emma Jones has asked you to tell us a little more about fog. Emma lives on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, so she is very well acquainted with fog and a lover of it, as I imagine you are. So I just wanted to open the floor for you to say a little something about fog and a little something about your reading selection and how you came to it this evening.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, the two are quite connected. I've been sort of, my posts on social media promoting this event were saying, my reading is reliably on brand. I'm reading about rural coasts in Atlantic Canada. This is what all my research is really about. And so I wanted to choose a reading that, or a story that reflected this region, the east coast of Canada, and Alistair Mcleod is the sort of obvious person to go to. And I was thinking about this story and remembering this story as a story about a sort of veteran miner reflecting on his career and reflecting on the changes that have been taking place and the sort of this moment of transition that's taking place in Cape Breton, and that it's really a sort of cultural change that's going on. And when I returned to it to think about reading it, I realized that the first few pages are really about environmental history as well, and this sort of this transition that's taking place in the environment as well as the culture of Cape Breton at that time. So it just seemed like a really perfect fit for NiCHE, thinking about environments and thinking about stories. And I wanted to represent Atlantic Canada. And the fog, yeah. So fog is the sort of perpetual presence here in Atlantic Canada, and I know that's true in certain other regions. There's certain places in the world that are just sort of known for fog, and we live with fog every day. And if that's true, then that means that there's a history behind that people have been thinking about that and what it means to sort of live in that kind of environment for a very long time. And so my research sort of goes back into the archives and looks for people talking about fog in Atlantic Canada in various ways. And what I found is it's a great way, it's sort of a great lens to look at the region, look at processes of settler colonialism in the region, look at the environmental history of the region, and look at what daily life is like. What was it like to live in the fog, particularly in an earlier period when your physical environment really had a profound daily effect on your life. So I find it super interesting, and I think it's interesting to think about weather that is not dramatic. So fog is often dramatic in terms of visual, but it's not a hurricane, it's not a storm, it's just this sort of wispy presence that kind of moves in and moves out, but it's had a dramatic life and death effect on people who live in these foggy regions, just the same as hurricanes or other more dramatic weather formations. So trying to think through the sort of ephemerality of fog and how that has a permanent historical presence in the region. And I see Jess just put up a link to a short piece that I wrote about fog last year. So
fantastic.
You can read that as well.
Thank you. And Jess, thanks for sharing that link. Let me throw now to you, Jessica, just a small question. I want to invite you to describe to us the reaction you have to the word apocalypse. What does it mean to you?
Okay, so I have two parts to this question. So my initial reaction to apocalypse, which I believe is because it's from my youth and was formative, is that I think of Y2K. And I remember watching so many apocalyptic doomsday documentaries right before the year 2000. I particularly remember the ones about the Mayan temple, where they measured all the years, and the Mayans prophesied that in the year 2000 the whole world would turn into flames or something. Anyways, I was convinced that I was going to die before my 14th birthday. Convinced. I remember being particularly scared that I was going to die a virgin. And yeah, I was just obsessed with it. And so that's like the initial thing I think of, is I think back to that time in my life when I was so afraid of these apocalypses, right? But that's like a different self. And I now think of apocalypses in terms of life stages, or growing up, or growing period. So like I think of each of my past selves as products of different apocalypses in my life, of different stages. I'm thinking of like the major one I had at the end of my PhD that led me to decide not to pursue like an academic a tenure track job, right? And to take on the work that I'm doing now. And I think about, I've been particularly, I can't think of the word. Anyways, the work of Adrienne Marie Brown and her sister, and their podcast, How to Survive the End of the World, is about apocalypse and thinking about apocalypse, and the work of Olivia Butler. And thinking about how the future that we want requires apocalypses to happen for the way that we know it, the way that the world that we live in to change, to end, kind of like how Andrew was talking about all those things ending. The future that we visualize and we know has to happen in order to avoid climate disaster or to avoid mass extinction, or think that we can control those things, requires apocalypses to happen. And they're not something to avoid, but rather something to embrace and to hold each other during, right? Because we have to bring each other through these apocalypses to the other side. So those are my two different ways that I think about apocalypse.
How wonderful. Thank you. And very much the essence of what we're doing here at Storytime is to hold each other through this period of time, which, you know, at the beginning I was calling an apocalypse and people thought I was being kind of histrionic about it. But really, exactly as you say, Jess, this is an incredible opportunity to become better in all kinds of ways in how we exist on the earth, and we need it. I want to end by asking you, Andrew, about a childhood memory that you have of Storytime books or reading. Take us back in time.
Yeah, I think all of my, profound stories that shaped me when I was younger happened where I am here, right? This cottage that I'm at, family cottage I'm at in Muskoka. I spent all my summers here as a kid, and so I tell people my soul resides here, and that's because of the stories that I have here, right? And in a lot of ways, the stories reside in particular places in this place, on this island here. Places that would have all had names before my ancestors dispossessed Indigenous people and then took up the land as cottages as part of this trend at the end of the 19th century. And so I want to acknowledge that, but in the ways in which my family, as part of that dispossession, have reimagined a lot of places. We've given new names to these places and attached new stories, and so there's layers of stories, I think, attached to this place, some of which I lived, and others which I've spent the last decade researching as part of my first book, and trying to uncover the layers of stories connected to this place. But for the personal stuff, the personal stories, I'm my kids and my niece and nephews. This will be the 7th generation of my family to spend time in this place, to spend time in this building, and so there are 7 generations of stories to go with that in my family here. And the oldest stories that I was witness to were from my great grandmother, when she would tell us stories that she learned when she was growing up in Truro, Nova Scotia. And, they didn't really have to do with this place necessarily, but they had a lot to do with what she felt were important lessons to, share with her great grandkids when she was visiting. And there were 13 of us and on that side of the family when we were all here together. And so this place collected all these kids together so that my great grandmother, when she came to visit, could pass on these stories, which we all just thought were like fun stories, but of course had meaning for her to make sure she told her to her grandkids. And that, the same kind of thing would happen with my grandparents when they were here. They would tell me about what it was like being here when they were young, before there was electricity, when you had to get here by a steamboat. And then when my dad was growing up, right, when he was witness to the kinds of changes, he would tell me about how at night you could look around the lake and there would be no lights. And now, it's a zoo here, right? It's a suburb of Toronto. And now, I'm a storyteller, right, as a historian. So now I'm trying to take what I recognize as a very distinct and unique part of this place, Muskoka, this cottage, and turn it into stories that actually are not just important to me, but I can sort of mobilize and convey to other people to help them understand why this place has meaning, not just to me and my family, but to Canadian history, to think about the many layers of a place like this that involve colonization, settler colonialism, dispossession, but also tourism and resilience and hardships overcome through community and rural identity and things like that. So that wasn't any one story, but it was just kind of trying to convey a sense of the ways in which this place has heaped stories on me every year of my life.
I love it. And Andrew, I think you just very recently arrived at the cottage, so the timing of this is just impeccable. I hope you have a wonderful stay there that is as full of stories as ever. So friends, that brings our story time to an end. I want to thank you for coming, and thank you to Andrew, Heather, Sarah, and Jessica for reading, to Emily St. John Mangel, Sheree, Demiline, Alistair Mcleod, and Eden Robinson for writing, and lastly to each of you for listening. The reading list for this episode will be published at Storytime 4 on Instagram very soon, and the next Storytime happens on September 6th in North America, which is September 7 in Australia. You can register now at goodisbetter.net. And you can find out more in my semi-regular email newsletter, which is called Love Notes. If you are heading off now, I'm mindful that it is extremely late at night for some of us. I wish you well, good night and good wishes. And if you're staying on to chat informally and to catch up, then let's get settled in to do that. It's been really wonderful to share story time with you. Thank you again to NiCHE for creating this and programming such a rich and abundant collection of readings.